Okay, so we're going to start, and I'm going to keep an eye on this awful piece of technology.
Sorry about that little technical difficulty getting started here.
And because of this awful piece of technology, we do not have a soundtrack.
Yeah.
Which we worked very hard on. It happens. I'll keep an eye on it.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Anyway, thanks for coming out, despite our difficulties. I'm Adam Hogan.
And I am Rockie Brockway.
Yeah, our bios are in the book, but what we want to talk about is how to change a subculture, some of the difficulties that come with it, and what we might learn from punk rock.
So, from an agenda perspective, we're going to kind of outline some goals, right? At the end of the day, everybody here at this conference, and those of you who have a tendency to migrate to other cities and hang out with other people of similar mindsets in this community, we are a subculture, okay? And as a subculture, we have the ability to influence culture, mainstream culture. So there's a number of challenges around that, but the goal really, so we're going to be talking about what our goals are from a high level, what these challenges happen to actually be. We're going to walk through some group theory. Is this guy on? Yeah, that guy's on. Let's turn him on. We're going to walk through some group theory and look at some case studies. We're going to talk about complexity theory, look at some case studies. We're even going to talk about adaptation and how systems and organizations, even organisms, and therefore organizations adapt, and try to wrap it all together with some interesting kind of takeaways from a recommendations perspective.
All right.
So last year I did a stable talk here. The background of this talk was basically, I'm probably getting close to that guy. I should stop walking around. So the background of that talk was, in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s, I was in this indie rock, math rock band. And we released 4 records, 3 of which were recorded by Steve Albini, if anybody has an idea of who that guy is. And so those first 3 records that we released in the early 90s just kind of missed the whole internet streaming, technology subset. So a bunch of lunatic fans about 2 years ago decided to put together a Kickstarter, and they raised $26,000 to basically take the old tapes, re-release them into digital format, get them into iTunes, Spotify, and all that stuff, which it didn't exist in at the time, because all those records were out of print, being from a bunch of indie labels that had, basically blown their wad over a couple of years and then disappeared, right? And as part of this Kickstarter that they put together, they also released the collective recordings of the band in a 6 LP box set with a 200-page history of the band. So this was really kind of cool from my perspective, since that was really kind of a hobby of mine as I was building my InfoSec career. So the talk that I did last year was just kind of, hey, you know what I've noticed being in both of these kind of subcultures? Here's some similarities and here's some things that we can kind of like share, blah, blah, blah. This guy happened to be watching that talk, and within an hour or so, I think, emailed me this long list like, hey, that was really interesting. You could really do much more than, you can really extrapolate, from your original topic into some really cool things like group theory and blah, blah, blah. So there's kind of part of it. It was a really long email. And
I'm verbose.
Yeah, he's very verbose. And so my response was, that's really cool. Put your money where your mouth is. Let's do a talk.
Which is how we got here. So if you're looking for a way to talk at your next conference, maybe just harass the speaker.
It pretty much worked.
Totally worked.
Okay. So, let's talk about some goals, right? We all hear throughout this industry that we need to change security culture. There's an inherent problem with that. right? Because what ends up being the reality is that there's these underlying subcultures within the overarching corporate mainstream. And so, as we'll kind of talk about as we move forward here, there are very, very patterned and historical difficulties in changing a culture.
So what we want to do is help you understand how you can try and influence a wider culture, right? So let's try to understand what it is, how it changes, how you can influence the change, and what we can try and do about it.
Right? Go ahead.
Now, we all accept that that's difficult, right? Getting an organization to change their culture is inherently difficult. That's not new. We're not breaking any ground there. But we want to get into how we can sort of blend the ideas we have back into the mainstream, right? Because we're going to spend this entire weekend agreeing with each other, patting each other on the back. We know how to do it. Users are awful. If they did what we told them, it'd be so wonderful, right? Well, how, right? I want to understand how to get those ideas back into the rest of the organization.
Right. So let's move into challenges, right? What are the challenges that we face today? Basically, security culture change is attempting to change user assumptions, beliefs, etc. Well, changing beliefs is, to a degree, almost like that's a pure belief system. If you believe that you don't need to if you don't need to change your password for every different website that you attend, that you are, have a login to, well, that's your own personal belief system, and that's very difficult to change. It is akin to, religious beliefs and political beliefs, right? And because we try to, corporations try to change these belief systems from a top-down perspective, right? Here's a mandated policy that you need to, have a different password for every website. That's where all of this really kind of falls apart, right? The mandated top-down policy is not going to change the end user's belief system.
We want to get to the point where we can encourage creativity, but there's going to be obvious limits, right? It's an awfully creative thing to get a tattoo on your face, but it might be too far. Same really goes with experimentation, right? We want to be creative, but there's certain limits there. We know this is an outlier subculture. That's why we like this con. It's great to be around, the rest of you nerds for an entire weekend, right? That's an amazing experience. It's why we come here, and what a great, contrast to beating our heads on our desks and trying to convince everyone else to listen to us the rest of the year, right? And we know we're going to be a little isolated. We're all here because we love this, right? And there's a handful of people that stumble into security, but for the most part, we're here, and by the way, spending our weekend to come to this conference because we absolutely love this stuff. And it's going to make us a little isolated, inherently.
And again, the people that go out of their way to come to something like a Derbycon or any, InfoSec/hacker type conference, we're all of the really kind of the same mindset. We like to break things and figure out how they work and potentially fix them, right? Potentially. Not all of us, We have the red versus blue and all that stuff, but so along those same lines, right? Patrick Gray, who has his Risky Business podcast, he always talks about you can't teach someone to love punk rock. They just do, right? And the same thing really kind of applies for information security, right? But, is it feasible?
Right. Can we mentor and train someone who's not wild about this 24/7, right? And that's where we are to a scaling problem. Of course, we want to hire someone who's going to live and breathe this stuff. Our passion for this industry is what drives a lot of our productivity, why we're in the spot we're in. But no one's got enough people, right? Now we're at the point where we've got to hire some more people, and that means probably hiring some people who, come 5 o'clock, are going to want to stop thinking about information security. And maybe that's a little weird for some of us, but that's the only way it's going to scale. So we have to be able to reach out across our very isolated subculture to reach out of the fringe and get, to people who are willing to learn, if not from a wildly borderline obsessive standpoint, right?
Right. All of us in here, for the most part, are probably falling in that category of this is what we do and we really like what we do. We can be very frustrated about the lack of results, and really this entire talk is about how we can fix those lack of results, because most of us are probably really good at what we do, but, we're not seeing the culture change. And this really, from my perspective, it's really, really important to try to find some of those fringe, really, talented outliers who can communicate with the business, can communicate with the people, and potentially find others within the organization that they might not have the same passion about what we do, but they kind of get it and they kind of like it. And this could be a 9-to-5 job for them, right? Contributing to the entire system.
So, recognizing those challenges that we're going to have to make this happen, to get a culture of change, let's try and dive into the meat of it now, right? So let's start with a definition. This is the suitably standard, it's not a little dull place to start, right? But this isn't, from Webster's, right? This definition, I think, actually is going to help understand, because the standard, dare I say, lazy definition of corporate culture is, it's the way we do things. Okay, well, let's get a little bit deeper than that. So this one I did from Edgar Schein. It says that culture is a pattern of shared tacit assumptions that was learned by the group as it solved problems, right? Because they worked well and were considered valid, those solutions are taught to new members. And that's what steamrolled to become the culture, right? So it's not an accident. It's not, we just happen to have this culture. That was learned. All those behaviors are learned, and ultimately it's because someone decided this is the way that works, right? Someone tried to solve a problem, they came up with a way that works, and that's where the culture grew out of, right? Now that also tells us a bit why it's difficult to change culture, right? Culture isn't written up on the whiteboard. You can't erase it one day, write up the new corporate culture. Because that's all learned behavior, and you don't instantly unlearn the way we've been doing things, right? You have to actually now show different solutions. You have to get people to learn a new way of doing things. That's what rolls into being a wider corporate culture, right? Now, it also can show us why sometimes corporate culture goes in the wrong direction, right? Because learned behavior doesn't mean you're right. You can learn the wrong way to do things, right? And I'm always reminded of Skinner's pigeons, right? B.F. Skinner was the first behavioral psychologist. He had an experiment where he had some half-starved pigeons, and he dropped some food in there. Well, the pigeons developed superstitions. If they were turning clockwise in a circle and the food came out, next time they get hungry, they turn clockwise in a circle. They were convinced they had some active control over, right? And now that's becoming part of their culture. They're learning this behavior. It's not right, but they think it is. And that's enough, right? I'm making fun of these pigeons for their ridiculous superstitions. I'm wearing my lucky con shoes. So it's not totally related to these ridiculous pigeons, right?
He is, by the way.
Whether there's any logic to it or not, if we happen to learn a solution, now that's part of the culture.
So here's what I would like you to ask yourself, right? Do you think that your security organization should be able to change and adapt, right? So we've kind of at a high level touched upon culture and subculture. But at the end of the day, the organization needs to figure out whether this is possible, right? So once you ask yourself that, now ask, do you think your organization is capable of changing and adapting? And that's the much bigger question that, hopefully as we kind of walk through this set of, posits and hypotheses, that hopefully we can help your organizations begin to really kind of change and adapt by thinking about things a little more in terms of subculture and how that can affect culture. So let's talk about group theory.
One of the ways that inherently affects our behavior and how we work with a team is whether we see ourselves as part of the team or not. And this is actually a fundamental part of our psychology. The way that's actually studied in the lab, and this is how we first got interested in the topic, because my graduate work was in behavioral economics. The way it's studied in the lab is start to look at studying, altruism or cooperative behavior, and the way it's done is experiments around game theory, where the rules are very strictly defined. Everyone's probably heard of the prisoner's dilemma. It's certainly the most popular experiment. The second is the ultimatum game, right? And that's sort of how we decide work on these ideas of altruism. The game goes like this. There's two people playing the game. They don't know each other. It's completely anonymous. You're never going to see each other again. Player A gets $100 and gets to decide how much of it to give to player B. Player B decides whether to accept or reject the offer. If he accepts, they both get the money. If he rejects, nobody gets any of the money. So, if people are perfectly rational, why would they ever turn down free money? Free money is free money. It's great. It's better than no money.
Right, even if it's like 1%.
Right. Now, that's not what happens. You run this experiment in the lab, and people routinely reject offers that are, less than 40, 30%. Right? This has been found routinely, and not just for $100. They went and did these experiments in Papua New Guinea with the equivalent of 3 months' salary. They were offering these people 3 months' salary, and they said, whoa, but he gets more. So screw both of us. Right? And reject the offer, they both got nothing. So we have inherent ideas baked way into our firmware, not going anywhere, of what constitutes fair, and when it's not, it offends us. Right? So I mentioned that to say, to get to this, that framework is done with a lot of different variables to explore this, and one of the interesting experiments is by group membership. So a lot of different experiments have looked at, okay, well, what's the difference in what's offered and what's accepted based on whether they're from the same country, whether they're the same religion or the same race, if they're part of the same group. And they do in fact find that people are more likely to cooperate with people that are part of the same group as them. They went on to see just how deep that ran and found it wasn't that important, right? You think, okay, yeah, you're part of the same country, part of the same religion. Yeah, you're pretty close, right? Now, nothing beats family ties. That's way up there. Of course, you cooperate with your family more than anybody else. After that, it kind of falls apart. They found that the groups were actually completely arbitrary, to the point where they ran the experiment where they said, okay, we're going to do it by group. Your team red, your team green. And they found the exact same result. They're like, well, I'm team red. I don't know about the team green guy. He's been team red for all of 5 minutes. Doesn't know what it means. He's like, team green. I don't know about these guys. Right? So this is inherently part of our psychology. If we start carving people up and say, you're in this team, you're on this team, we are literally fixing in people's brains how well they're going to work with each other and how they're going to cooperate with each other.
Red team, blue team.
Sound familiar?
Sound familiar.
All right.
So PBS Frontline had a really interesting piece called A Class Divided in, I believe, 68.
Oh, I remember. It was right after Martin Luther King.
So Martin Luther King Jr. had just been assassinated. I believe that was 68. And this third grade teacher basically, in order to try to explain to her students in her third grade class about why this man was assassinated, put together basically what was a discrimination exercise. It was a little bit controversial, right? But she basically took the class and said, okay, now it's well known that all blue-eyed people are smarter than brown-eyed people. Okay? And so you brown-eyed people, you're probably going to have a little bit more difficulty in life because the blue-eyed people inherently are smarter. And the kids all absorbed that, and, they started kind of like dividing within the class and all that. The next day, she basically said, to the class, I'm wrong. I misspoke. Right? Brown-eyed people are smarter than blue-eyed people.
Completely reversed it the next day.
Completely reversed it, and they ate it up.
Yeah.
Right? Now, to the point where, that person failed this math quiz. Typical brown-eyed behavior.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, the kids bought into it right away. It's a little creepy to watch.
Yeah.
It's not entirely sure if you're supposed to experiment on your students.
Right. That's a little, yeah. I kind of have a little bit of respect for that aspect and level of experimentation on it, but
it was the 60s. They didn't have informed consent. So we're looking at a real double-edged sword here. We know there are great things that come with being a part of a strong team, right? Everybody thinks patriotism is a great idea, right? Of course, we're all proud of the country we come from. But if you stop and think about it, you can all name a few different times where strong patriotism led people to war. Right? That's a double-edged sword.
Right. So we all really kind of inherently value the concept of being on a strong team, but there are also dangers to that. And we'll kind of get into that as we get into like complexity theory and whatnot. But you know, at the end of the day, a very strong team has a decent probability of alienating itself. Okay? We start talking about cliques and things of that nature, right? This infosec culture, subculture here, right? We have a tendency to have a hard time with the end users and the challenges that we face trying to communicate security up into the business, right? So there comes a time when these strong subcultures end up alienating themselves and just kind of building walls around themselves. And when that happens, they become ineffective, right?
Really need a way to bridge the subcultures, right? Because it's not as simple as just knocking down the wall. That's not going to work, right? We're here because we're a strong subculture. That's not going to go away. And we don't want to get rid of the passion that drives us, right? So now we just need a way to bridge those subcultures. And I think some have been pretty successful about that, right? It's not that we have to break apart that, but maybe we need an ambassador, right? Maybe someone else has to work to bridge those cultures. And that's one way to do it, but we do need to figure out to get people to work together and make sure they're not going to completely silo off, right?
Right. And within our industry, we've heard, you've heard so many years of talks about we need to bust out of our own echo chamber, right? We are a subculture that comes together with like-minded people who like to break things and blah, 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 and we're conveying the same messages over and over to ourselves, right? This is not the first time you've heard this, right? So the problems with these strong subcultures and building walls around themselves is that you end up, the outcome becomes this echo chamber, and we're not really doing anything. We're not making any progress. So, the dangers of being too entrenched in a subculture. Besides my wife, does anybody have any idea who this guy is? G.G. Allen.
Wow.
Thank you. One
go.
person.
Yeah.
I'll buy you a drink after this.
Yeah. Didn't think we'd seen him.
Yeah, we didn't. We did not think we'd seen him. Right. G.G. Allen is a very extreme example of the punk rock subculture.
Right.
Right. I'm not going to get into any of the details. You can Google him.
Yeah. It's super gross.
It's really gross. But you have to kind of weigh, because we're doing this analysis between information security subculture and punk rock subculture. You have to kind of also analyze this whole. There's going to be a subset of our subculture that are the super geeks that are super hardcore about what they do. Okay, and there are dangers about that, right?
I first started thinking about this because I'm afraid I'm guilty of it. I was interviewing people and sort of expect, like, okay, well, tell me about the first, BBS you dialed into. Maybe that shouldn't be the standard. We've got to reach out to more people than, just geeks that came up the way I did. That's obviously not going to scale. But that's kind of where I started, right? And certainly a lot of people like to brag about their geek bona fides. I said, okay, well, this is, how I got into it. This is how I learned it. This is how I self-taught, right? So I think we got to branch back to that and say, okay, look, it's great for me. I'm certainly glad the way I came up and got into this industry, but that doesn't mean it's for everybody, right? So that's the question we really want to ask. Is it necessary to be obsessed with it, to be a good security professional?
Is it necessary to be that hardcore about something to be successful at what you're trying to accomplish?
Right. What you see in those music genres is arguing over who's more hardcore. What's actual punk music? No, that's mainstream. Right.
I think right now during this dumb computer's version of this talk, we're listening to the Bad Brains. Okay? So many of the people who are familiar with bands of that genre, of that original kind of punk genre, will take a look at a Green Day and be like, that is not punk rock. Okay? But at some point, Bad Brains, Black Flag, Sex Pistols, Clash, at some point, those ideals influenced others that may not have had that really hardcore subculture focus. And that influence got into the mainstream culture, if that makes sense. Yeah, and if you end up just hanging on to that just pure hardcore portion of your subculture, sure, you will likely end up with some level of a crazy cult following like Gigi Allen did, but your sphere of influence becomes close to zero. It's approaching null.
Let's dive into some examples here. Mergers and acquisitions are a particularly interesting case to look at how cultures change. Right? When we take two organizations, slam them together, okay, we're doing one culture, the other. Are we going to leave you separate? Is one culture going to dominate the other? Are we going to try and blend them together? Are we going to end up with some sort of counterculture where one side's pissed off at the other one? Right? Now, in every single merger that happens, they always say, oh, we're going to take the best from both. Right? And it obviously doesn't happen. To the point where, if you go to business school and learn about mergers and acquisitions, the first thing they teach you is the vast majority of them fail completely. To the point where it's a research topic in business schools, like, why do people keep doing this? It's literally like, why do they keep trying this? Like, they fail so often. What is going on to the point where the leading theory for why mergers happen in the first place is managerial hubris. You must be so wildly overconfident in your own capabilities to say, like, yeah, sure, most of them fail. I got this. Right? Like, that's how unusual it is for one of these to succeed. So,
Go back. Read that.
Oh,
I
this
love
was
that.
a demotivator poster, right, for acquisition.
In case you guys can't read this.
Yeah, that one's the text pretty small, right? The discovery that you are no longer a big fish in a small pond, or even a small fish in a big pond, but a small fish in a big fish. Right? So, as an example, and one kind of close to home, Cisco acquired SourceFire, and I've been working at SourceFire for a few years when that happened. There's good and bad to come out with it, and in the sake of diplomacy, I'm going to start with the good. It was wildly successful with their research team. All right, when you take a look at Cisco, Cisco, sorry, that's wrong. Cisco's SIO team and SourceFire's vulnerability research team, they came together, and it's been a wild success. Those guys love it. Right, the guys who are writing the snort rules and doing that kind of research. It's been absolutely great for them. The people I know that are on those teams are still there, and they really enjoy it. Right. One of the absolute first things they did was like, we've got these two teams, right? SIO and VRT. What are we going to do? They dropped both the names, and so it's a new organization now called Talos. And I think that's got to play a big role. We just went over how much it can matter if I literally make up a team and say, you're green and you're red. We actually work with each other differently. I think that must have been a tremendous influence on how they were able to immediately start working together. We're a new team. Now we're Talos. Not the old team. Now we're working together. Now, I don't think that's the only effect. So let's kind of compare with something that was less than successful. The sales team. Those did not merge together quite so happily. And sure, like, very few people I know on the sales side are actually still there, right? And I left. So did he. It's literally most people I know and worked with. I don't think if they had given us a shiny new name, it would have had any effect on it, right? I really do think it helped with the research teams, but they also have very similar backgrounds. People in the research teams were coming from the same place. Okay, we're going to research malware. We're going to find ways to stop the bad guys and get that out there. So a lot of the same background, right? A lot of the same goals. A lot less so with the sales team. Wildly different ways of doing things. And of course, Cisco didn't say like, oh, we're going to dominate your culture. They flat out said, we want to bring in the ways you guys are doing this, right? You guys were able to build this company out of nothing. You're selling, security value. But the way you sell one product to a customer and the way you try and sell 20 products in a bundle is so wildly different. Right? Completely different ways of going about it. The people who were in those jobs were in it for different reasons, had totally different backgrounds. as opposed to people who were just, again, rabid security people, as opposed to people who maybe came up through networking and routers, like, let me give security a shot, right? So, two wildly different processes really didn't blend well together at all. A little bit of music. Now we don't have a little bit. So, why didn't it work for the sales team, right? I don't think it's just as simple as, hey, they needed a new name, right? The more we look into it and think, okay, what else could have changed? It's like, well, there's way too many variables. And that's ultimately the problem. How are we going to tell you how to fix your culture? We're not. There are so many variables involved. We actually come back to this is an insanely complex system. And I don't mean that in that it's complicated, right? Complexity is a whole other branch of science now. A complex system is a completely different way of looking at a problem. And given that its complexity is sort of fitting that there's no good definition for it. But the basic idea is that a complex system is not just the sum of its parts. It is actually more than the sum of its parts, because the interaction between the parts matters. And when they interact, it actually becomes so unpredictable that it's really tough to manage, right? So we see that with emergence. We see that with the organizations that organize themselves into patterns or change their strategies based on adaptation. We actually come back to a complex system.
Go back real quick. That image right there.
Yeah.
That image right there is, it is the representation of the relationships within the E. coli virus.
Right. So the simplest organization.
One of the simplest organisms.
Right. That researchers are looking at, and that's about how complicated it is when you start breaking apart the pieces, right? Now let's take that and do that with all the different motivations and all the different people and the teams and who they work with, and we are wound up with an insanely complex system, and we're not going to be able to predict the results of what's going on. Everyone's going to be going in different directions, so we want to be able to treat it the way we're learning about other complex systems.
Right. And so, when we talk about, obviously within business, we all understand conceptually the top-down versus bottom-up kind of managerial style or how to run a business, right? But within complex systems, that, for lack of a better word, intelligent design aspect of it doesn't pan out, right? You want to enforce policy from a top-down perspective. That's just kind of the nature. Yeah, I've got an idea. Now I need to push it out. Here's the new password policy. Push it out, right? But the reality is that ends up being, because of those belief systems that kind of attach to the whole equation, that becomes a cultural issue. And the only way to really change cultural issues is from the bottom up and taking advantage of the subcultures, right? Therein lies one of the biggest problems with information security in terms of, us trying to change the security culture. For the most part, we're trying to force this top-down approach.
So again, let's take a look at an example, right? Take your typical security awareness program. We want to tell the users, don't click that link, make your password strong, and all these things. And the typical way is to set that policy and say, follow the policy. That's a top-down approach. Now, why would the user hear that and think anything other than this, right? What's the difference? We're fundamentally saying, yeah, you got your way of doing things, but I need you to care more about the company, right? That's the way any person with any kind of cynicism is going to see a security awareness program, right?
Right, and so let's take a look at some awareness success examples, right? Of the security awareness programs that I've seen actually succeed, it's really targeting more of the personal family side of the end user, right? Here's how you can protect your children on the internet. Here's how, you have to personalize it, right? This isn't a top-down kind of, you must do this or whatever, right? This is here's a best practice, and this is how it relates to you and your family, right? So, what we really have is this clash of, within an organization, the top-down versus the bottom-up. And I stole this slide from the deck that I did last year, right? If on the one side of the house you have the manager who is, hovering over the people that report to him, hovering over their shoulder, making sure that they are doing their job, even if it's a detriment to, like, your job is X, but even this security awareness training that is going to be an hour out of your day, that even might get pushed off because top-down management is like, we have to have results, right? And you have a job to do. The clash of that versus a bottom-up, natural kind of society, not society, but a subculture, right? If you find, so the slide, right? If you are involved meaningfully, in the design of your work, if you find joy in your work, if you have the passion and ability to speak honestly about, right? So collaboration and the whole wisdom of crowds concept really is much more effective in terms of being able to change at a bottom-up subculture level, changing the culture itself. And direct parallels with, the indie rock and punk rock subculture.
Okay. We'll go over another example. Quite a while ago, Atari tried to bring in a new CEO. He had a very strong background in marketing, and he'd had tremendous success going into companies and improving them vastly by implementing individual incentives, right, to reward people for their hard work, and a career system, right? Here's your career path. Here's the promotion you should be going for. Let's map that out for you so you understand, what rewards are down the line, right? So he had used this system in a couple different places in order to build that organization and get people motivated and work. It failed miserably at Atari. Those guys were building games in such a collaborative format, they were just sitting around spitballing with each other. They were always working together, bouncing ideas off of each other, to the point where they came around and said, oh, hey, this is a great idea. We've got a reward for you. Whose idea was it? They shrugged. We don't know. We worked together on everything. So when they started naming, Engineer of the Month, the rest of the team was kind of resentful. Like, we did that together. What's going on? So this is textbook business. Go in and make a company better. Get people the incentives they deserve. And it didn't work because he didn't understand the culture here, right? And if you don't understand that, the changes you can make can be that big enough to just throw the entire thing off.
And unfortunately, it wasn't even understanding the culture; it was understanding the subculture.
Right. Yeah. This guy worked with marketing and worked in business. He never worked with engineers who had worked with each other in this way. He didn't understand it at all. He was completely baffled when they came back frustrated and frankly started leaving the company. So, yeah, we'd come back and saying these complex systems are too complex to predict what happens. So do we give up? Well, no. The theory of complex systems is ingrained in a lot of other sciences now, in physics and chemistry and economics, to the point where we can sort of take a look at what's worked for them.
All right, so how can we actually then take these complex systems and improve them, right? And that really then comes back to, adaptation theory, right? Adaptation theory really kind of comes down to a subset of variables, including variation in systems, and then the whole selection process, right? Trying to do something, and if it doesn't work, okay, well, I'm going to learn from my mistakes, and or some type of mutation doesn't work, blah, 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 and in nature, then that species or that variation of that species doesn't actually then flourish in that environment, right? Right, so this again kind of ties back to a talk that I did, I think 3 years ago now, right? But what then does make an actual system evolve? And when we talk about natural security systems, the whole concept is all about, right, presenting the end, the end contributor of the organization or organism, presenting them with a challenge. That challenge could be finding food. That challenge could be in a group setting, finding the whereabouts of a sunken nuclear sub, if anybody knows the USS Scorpion story, right? But the bottom line, though, is that in an organizational setting, presenting challenges then starts to instill competition within the individual elements of that organism or organization. It's the same concept, right? And then that competition, once the individual elements of the organization realize that we're all kind of trying to accomplish the same goal, that competition leads to cooperation, right? And then it's a repeating cycle that gets bigger and bigger and bigger from the top down, or I'm sorry, from the bottom up, right, within the organization. This is how adaptation theory can help organizations really from, again, the bottom up, right, change the culture. Because at the subculture level, we're, working with challenges, we're identifying competition, and through that competition, we're figuring out how to cooperate with each other. And that's how adaptation occurs, right? And at the end of the day, the simple statement is that adaptation is going to occur. When it occurs when the end user or variable of the system either moves out of or gets forced out of their comfort zone. And that's a huge, huge part of this whole equation, because most organizations today live within its own comfort zone, right? The stock price is good, our revenues are good, blah, blah, blah. But the next week, we just got hacked. Well, that's right, because you didn't get out of your comfort zone and, instill this kind of bottom-up change.
Right. One thing you should knock out anytime you're talking about evolution is evolution doesn't mean you're going to get better. It doesn't mean you'll always get stronger, you always get faster. It actually means the population as a whole adapts to its environment better. And that doesn't mean it's good for everyone. In fact, that's this up here. The subtext says, it could be the purpose of your life is to only serve as a warning to others. And extinction is actually an important part of an evolutionary system. What doesn't work dies out, right? So it's not that evolution is actually going to make you better. We might actually want to target the ways that don't work and help them die faster. Right? That's also a way to make the population improve, right? So if you want to get a system where it's going to evolve, again, you need those two things. You need variation and you need selection. And that's it, right? So we need to figure out how to do that. Now, we can look at nature and can actually come back to that. Like, well, you don't mutate at random, necessarily. In fact, nature tends to vary mutation rates by gender, right? If you try a mutation on a female and something goes horribly wrong, then she's not going to have any babies. If you screw up a male, that other female is probably still going to have babies, right? Because of the inequality in reproduction, that's the case. And because of that, there tends to be a whole lot more mutation in males in species, right?
Serial killers.
Yeah, take any given prison, it's full of men, right?
Right. And the problem, though, here is that if we're trying to change the security culture, we don't have the luxury of waiting thousands and or millions of years for nature's mutation variations to then potentially have a positive impact on our business.
Right. So the lesson is ultimately we need a safe environment where we can experiment, right? We need that male we can screw up and no one will miss, right? We sort of need to figure out when is it okay to experiment and how can we start doing that in order to start discovering new ways of doing things and better ways of doing things. And of course, we can learn from previous experimentation. That's a huge difference. If you learn about evolution entirely through biology, you always think in the terms of genes, and it's wildly different when we talk about evolutionary systems where there's human beings involved, because we can talk to each other, and we can learn from each other, right? Genes don't just pass on through sex. I can literally tell you the good ideas, and we can learn that way, right?
And speaking of genes, a moment of silence for Mr. Gene Wilder.
By that extension, right, we want to know when not to mutate. Some problems are easy to solve. If you've got a physics or a chemistry problem, you literally solve for X. I don't need to mutate or experiment. I know what the solution is. And also when the cost of failure is significant. You run a nuclear power plant, you're probably not going to just start flipping buttons at wild and say, we should experiment, right? That's not a good option for you. So we need, again, to find that sort of optional or optimal mutation way. When is it safe to experiment and when is it not? And the model here, I think, if we can learn from it, is what's called skunk works, which is actually what Lockheed Martin called this organization. They literally took the engineers, sent them up in a different building. They pulled them out of all the bureaucratic nonsense they usually had to deal with and said, here, Here's your own little playground. Go figure stuff out. Go play. And out of that came like the U-2 spy plane and frankly a lot of other advancements that Lockheed's been very profitable on. To the point where you can't, if you want to take this model, you can't call it a skunk works, they'll sue you. It's also still going on. This organization is still running. They're still doing research in drones, and I thought this was insane. They're actually working on tiny robot spiders that will crawl around the inside of airships envelopes to find holes in it and repair them.
Airships.
That's a thing. Still, I don't know if it's like some weird steampunk fantasy that they're actually dovetailed on, or if there's legitimately people are heading back towards airships. I want to learn more, but yeah, this is literally what they're working on. I mean, this is a headline from a month ago or so, right? So this organization is still set up as a way to experiment and try new things.
And you see the exact same thing in punk innovation, right? So punk, when you really kind of look at the roots, was a response to the 70s giant, long-winded, big, complicated songs. You think of your Pink Floyds, your King Crimsons, and things of that nature, even Zeppelin to a degree, right? And as from a subculture that took a look at that and saw, wow, really thought how arrogant all that is, and then coming to say, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're basically going to break this down in our own experimental environment. We're going to break this into very simple songs. We're going to do stuff. We're going to create art that, is outside of the mainstream and basically get our own subculture. But again, you still need the isolated fringes. It can't be so it doesn't isolate the mainstream. You still need some of those fringes for the innovation, right? And so you have people like this guy on stage, Henry Rollins. Henry Rollins, a legendary icon, and today is this, amazing world traveler. But when all of this was going down, his whole subculture ideal was, this stuff over here that is accepted today, don't like it. I'm going to do something else.
Right. So let's wrap this up and bring everything back together, right? What we want to get across more than anything else is that these systems, if you accept our premise that the systems we're working in are complex, that the way to get them to improve is to make sure that they can evolve. And to get to that point, I want to say, don't be afraid to fail. That's the culture we want to build, the point where people can try something different, where they can try something new. In a corporate organization, I don't think people try and maximize success as much as they often try to minimize failure. That's not the same thing. So we want to get to the point where we can actually celebrate your failure, right? Thomas Edison said, I didn't fail these experiments. I found 10,000 ways it didn't work. And we should try and do that, the same way. In fact, we were talking earlier, if you can think of a good way you failed and learned a lesson from it, let us know or send us that information. Frankly, we'd like to put together a panel for next year's Derbycon. If you want to come up, take 5 minutes to say, this is the project we were doing, I screwed up, here's what I learned, that'd be great. Because in the scientific community, we tend to only talk about success. But we're all on the same road. And if you can leave some warning signs for the people behind you, that's just as valuable. We should literally stand up and applaud your failure if you're willing to share it with us. Right? So we want to do that at the conference. If you've got a way you failed spectacularly and a lesson you learned from it, let us know. We'll see if we can put together a panel. We'll see if it turns out interesting. Maybe that'll work out for next year. But we do want to say that, in your own organization, let people try stuff. And if it doesn't work out, say, that was a great idea. Where can we go from here?
Okay. So, if anybody's unfamiliar with this book, get familiar with it. Okay. Thaddeus Russell wrote a book a couple years ago called A Renegade History of the United States. In it, he talks about how, and this quote from him on the slide is taken from an interview that he did on the Joe Rogan Experience. But basically, this book is all about how the fringe subcultures really set the course and steered overarching American culture as a whole, right? And a great little example here is in 1968. At the time, there were very stringent laws against gay and homosexuals. And at the time, the mafia, a subculture, owned a majority of these in New York City, a majority of these bars and inns and things of that nature. And they were like, you know something? I don't really care about the rules. It's like prohibition again, right? I don't really care about the laws. You know, anybody wants to come in and drink and we can make profit and all that stuff, yeah, come on in. Well, that led to the Stonewall riots, right? And the Stonewall riots were really kind of a keystone for, you know, the gay rights movement, in that on the one side, and once all this happened, they were the police were kind of like breaking and get whatever, blanking on the term, but they were disrupting these these bars and these speakeasies and all that stuff. So on the one side of the street, you have all these police with batons ready to crush skulls, and on the other side of the street, you have all these drag queens like doing like full on like Rockette type movements, and over 5 days.
That's on YouTube now.
Yeah, it is. But after those 5 days, the results of this really kind of steered American culture and viewpoints to the extreme fact that not even 3 years later, a book was published. A book was published that the author, had that not happened as well, that was a variable of this culture change, but had that not happened, the author who wrote this book would have been in prison, and that book was The Joy of Sex. And I'm guessing that a lot of you probably have seen that from your parents, because I know I found my parents' copy. Right? But that book, instead of that author going to jail or prison, not even 3 years after this big shift of American culture and the gay rights movement, that book was on the New York Times top 5 list for 70 weeks. All right?
So we're often told history is driven by our leaders, and if you dig in, you find, no, it might have just been a pack of weirdos who were willing to push the boundaries. So basically we want to say be able to experiment, right? Experts can't necessarily tell you how to do what you need to do, right? Now, you got to start somewhere. Again, we don't have a million years to try things at random and evolve that way. We got to start somewhere. So let's start with other ideas that people have, good ways to do that. So every talk you go to today, you can say, look, that's a great talk. That's how I should be doing it. But I would suggest that another way of looking at it would be, okay, that's a really good talk. That's a good place to start experimenting. It might work for us, but we'd have to give it a try and find out. And also, we can learn from other subcultures. We talked about punk rock because that's Rockie's background, and we had all this data on it, right? So that's where we started talking about it. Any subculture you're going to be able to pull the same lessons, and if you don't know any people in some tight subcultures, go to the after parties tonight, right? You can start meeting them. And there's going to be a whole chance to learn about how, these kind of cultures evolve.
Reward innovation, right? We've got a few more minutes here. Rewarding innovation and incentivizing change through challenges is really, again, one of the most important takeaways here. I don't have my reading glasses on, but the quote here, I'm not a huge Branson follower, but this is a great quote, right? Innovation happens when people are given the freedom to ask questions and the resources and power to find the answers. That's fantastic, right?
I'm skipping. We're out of time.
Yeah.
Let's go to the last slide.
All right, last slide.
All right. So again, let's go back to the original definition of what culture is, right? That culture comes from learned behavior. What worked in the past, we learn, and that steamrolls into our culture. So keep that in mind, because if you're a problem solver, you are contributing to culture, right? Whether you like it or not. If you're developing solutions and people can learn about the solutions from you, that is where your organization culture is coming from.
And at the end of the day, also, this version of this talk did have Fight the Power playing.
It was going to be great, really.
It was going to be dope. But yeah, listen, forget the bosses. I know that, that to a degree that's, fuck it, that's punk, right? Forget the bosses. Your subculture solutions contribute to culture, right? And that's really where all of this, when we as a collective subculture here talk about the frustrations of being able to enact change within an organization, this is how we can do it. It can't be top down. It has to be bottom up from the subculture perspective. All right.
So thanks everyone for coming. We should probably have to let the next person go. Of course, if you have any questions, please let us know. Come up to that talk or in the bar later tonight. I'd be happy to talk to you guys. And again, if you want to celebrate your own failures, let us know, and maybe we can scrape together enough to put together another talk.
Right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.